But just give me, your initial thoughts. We have President Biden saying, we're going to respond to these drone attacks. And then we have people like Lindsey Graham, who have issued statements saying, quote, hit Iran now, hit them hard. I'm sure for some people that can be overwhelming. So if what your take?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short take is that what happened is, in part, it's more accidental than escalation. Obviously, we've had ongoing friction between the US forces and various groups with ties of some sort or other to Iran, whether that's in Yemen or Syria or Iraq. So those have been ongoing. The drone attack is part of that. This one, of course, ended by killing three American servicemen and women, which sounds like an escalation, but a lot of the early reports suggest that the Iraqi group that sent the drones probably did not expect it to even make it through the US air defenses. My understanding is that there was a kind of mix up of a US drone was returning at the same time, which caused some confusion and allowed it to get through. But the immediate reaction that I've seen in the Middle East certainly is that the Iraqi group that claimed credit put out a statement that was immediately trying to emphasize distance between themselves and Iran. The group is very closely tied to Iran. And so the fact that they're saying we see things differently from the Iranians certainly suggests that Iran is pressuring them to say, this was all you, don't drag us into this. Now, the open question is that a sort of fiction that the Iranians want the Iraqi group to take all the blame, even though Iran had a role, or does it reflect reality? Because in some cases, these groups in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon get caught. I mean, they're tied to Iran. They have close connections to Iran. They're allied with Iran. They get funding from Iran, but they often do have their own kind of independent command structures, and so they're not necessarily just fulfilling Iranian orders, right? They're taking initiatives on their own, and in this case, it's still an open question whether the initiative was entirely from Kataib Hezbollah, the Iraqi group that launched the drone, or whether Iran had some role. I mean, in my view, the fact that Iran is working so hard to distance themselves from the attack suggests, number one, that they don't want escalation, that they do not want a direct military conflict with the US. And they also understand right away that the deaths of three American soldiers make conflict more likely. So if they don't want that, and yet they know the action made it more likely, to me, the two leading explanations are, number one, if they had a direct role in it, they did not intend it to succeed. They did not intend it to cause the fatalities that it did. And once it caused the fatalities, they have to do sort of damage control. Or probably, in my view, at this point, I wouldn't express 100% confidence in this, but I think it's probably slightly more likely that the statements are in fact accurate, that the Iraqi group took the initiative on their own, and Iran is now trying to emphasize that this was not their action.
Absolutely. That completely makes sense. I know you kind of mentioned too that it seems like that the when the drone was sent, it was never intended to actually meet its target. And there was a mix up with, there was a drone coming in and out of American airspace. How does this kind of mix up happen? I mean, that's a pretty big error.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak on it because um, that's really more about the American military side, and I'd say it's kind of beyond my area of expertise. So I'll refrain from commenting on that.
Very smart. No, absolutely. I have a lot more questions though, regarding your expertise as
Sure.
well. A lot of people are saying that this could be if we do decide to escalate, this could really change the US's strategy so far that we've had in the Middle East in terms of conflict negotiation. Is that the case?
I mean, I suppose I suppose it's more of a risk at the moment that things change and that the US does get more deeply involved. I am not ready to predict that we're going to see a major escalation. Um, I tend to be fairly conservative, not in the ideological sense, but just in terms of being like reserved, I guess, in predicting escalations, because usually people, especially when you see a deliberate kind of delay between the attack and the response, that means that people are thinking through the options and deciding the best way to handle this. Now, in my view, President Biden, the lesson that he took away from the 2000s with the US invasion of Iraq is that it would be a very bad idea for the US to be involved directly in a full-scale war in the Middle East. So I think that the Biden administration feels every incentive to avoid the kind of escalation that would lead to a major sustained war. Now they're going to react. They're obviously going to react. But I would predict that it probably looks sort of the same as we've seen other responses, whether to the Houthis or to groups in Syria and elsewhere, where there's a kind of deliberate bombing that's designed to send a message that if you inflict some damage on us, we're going to inflict some damage on you. And as long as we don't perceive a kind of material escalation on your part, we're not going to do the same thing either. So that's what I would anticipate happening. The response will be probably somewhat more intense or inflict somewhat more damage than other responses have. But in my view, when I look at the things that both the US and Iran are saying and doing right now, there's very little to suggest that either side wants to escalate this. They also neither side is willing to sort of totally back down and not react. So each side, I think, is going to continue to react in one way or another. But at the moment, it seems like it's likely to stay at the kind of smaller scale level.
Absolutely. That definitely makes sense. I know John Kirby said something kind of similar a couple of days ago. But then, so how do you reconcile that with, you have Lindsey Graham and you have a couple other people, and Nancy Mace kind of calling for decisive and immediate action. But from what I understand from you, we're like, we're not even sure that we can say definitively it was Iran. So what is that? Where does that come from?
I mean, I don't think it's any secret that Lindsey Graham, in particular, has been pushing for greater escalation against Iran for decades now. And so, if there's a provocation, my immediate prediction would always be Lindsey Graham is going to use this to push for escalation. There's a vested interest for Graham and for certain other figures, some of them in the Democratic Party, some of them in the Republican Party. But there's a number of American politicians who very much see Iran as our main enemy, not just in the region, but probably in the world. And they've been opposed to every attempt by the U.S. to from the JCPOA nuclear deal back in 2014 under the Obama administration. They've been opposed to every attempt to reach a sort of accommodation or to tamp down tensions with Iran. And so anytime you see an attack on U.S. interest or U.S. targets, that's coming from groups linked to Iran, you're going to see these calls for escalation. I think there's probably a partisan angle as well, in that, especially as we're in an election year now, there's various people are going to see an advantage in using a foreign policy, a military conflict to portray the incumbent as weak. And to then lash out against him. If the Biden administration responds, as I expect, with a relatively restrained hit on Iranian-linked targets inside Iraq, and then you get another attack on U.S. interests later on, I would expect to see Lindsey Graham and others say very loudly that this second attack happened because the Biden administration was weak. So the kind of ongoing tension and tit for tat struggles creates partisan incentives, I think, in American politics.
As you mentioned, we're coming up on an election year, 2024. In a year, less than a year, Biden might not be president anymore. We might have former President Trump. Um, how do you feel? I mean, Trump has been president before, so there's kind of an example of his, relations with this part of the region. Would there be a different kind of response, would you anticipate?
And that's a good question. I mean, I think the response I just saw from Trump today is that if I were president, this never would have happened. So the desire is to portray a kind of to portray a policy that is going to suggest that the US would lash out so hardly that American adversaries would never even think about launching the attack in the first place. Is that likely to work? I mean, in this scenario, I mean, if the theory is true that Iran did not order this, then I don't know how striking back more intensely at Iran is actually going to change anything. I mean, I do think that the Trump during his last kind of the last administration showed a desire to lash out extremely hard in response to any sort of provocation. So I don't know. I guess if I were to predict, like if Trump were president today and something like this happened, I would predict a somewhat more intense response. I mean, maybe the US would strike a target inside Iran rather than just inside Iraq. On the other hand, I think that Trump shares the same kind of disinclination towards involving the US in a full-scale war, especially a full-scale ground war that Biden does as well. So how different does that look on a material level? I'm not sure. It's hard to predict. I think you would definitely see more harsher rhetoric coming out of a Trump administration. Maybe striking out against higher profile targets. So whereas the Biden administration might be more inclined to say, like, all right, we're going to carefully calibrate our response towards a target of equivalent value on your side, maybe the Trump administration would be more inclined to escalate it up a level. But at least initially, I don't think they would have a desire to go towards full-scale war. Although the open question is that if you play this game where you keep escalating further and further, sometimes it's impossible to avoid escalating all the way.
Absolutely. My last question for you. Of course, the Middle East is kind of just a minefield of a region when it comes to geopolitical relations. How does this incident play into the war that's already going on between Israel and Hamas, and how the U.S. has been backing it so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly directly connected. I also think that the intervention of the Houthis in the Red Sea has a direct role here. It's no secret that there's just incredible anger and sadness and bitterness towards Israel and the US in the Middle East now, throughout the Middle East. And there is, in some ways, a kind of competitive aspect to this between various groups, not just those linked to Iran, but others as well, who are eager to if not involve themselves directly, at least to give the impression that we are doing something to stand up for the Palestinians, because that then in an environment in which standing up for the Palestinians, standing up against Israel or the US is a popular response, then positioning yourself as a group that's doing that is going to improve your own kind of domestic position. And so I think the fact that the Houthis have gained considerable popularity in the region by virtue of their actions in the Red Sea, and the kind of the perception that is inflicting real damage, economic damage on Israeli and U.S. Economic interests, provides an incentive to other groups like Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq to try and inflict damage as well, to say that we're not going to be outflanked by the Houthis or another group, that we want to portray ourselves as part of this resistance. And so as long as the war in Gaza is going on, I would expect to see more groups throughout the region try and involve themselves in some way, whether it's kind of superficially or less superficially.